Hello everyone! Thank you for joining me for another video. Today I thought I'd do something a little bit different and I would talk about modern day ateliers. What are they? What do you learn? What are their pros and cons? And what are my thoughts after attending several different ateliers throughout the US? I also did a call for questions on my Instagram and to ask you guys what your atelier questions might be, so I'll be answering some of those as well. First, I want to talk about my background and how I even came to study at an atelier in the first place. When I was around 12 or 13, I started studying with a wonderful artist in Baton Rouge, Louisiana named Carol Araby. And Miss Carol introduced me to a book called Lessons in Classical Drawing by Juliet Aristides, and that book led me to the Art Renewal Center, which led me to a list of ARC accredited ateliers. From what I gathered from the ARC's website, ateliers were drawing and painting schools dedicated to working from life, and in a classical representational manner. So when I was 16, I took my first ever art workshop at Grand Central Atelier in New York. At the time, I was super overwhelmed and intimidated, but I really liked the method and I really liked the art that I saw hanging on the walls, so I knew I wanted to pursue atelier training from that moment on. But the idea of moving to New York seemed far too overwhelming for my 16-year-old from Louisiana self, and so I ended up moving to Texas instead to study at a smaller atelier established by a Florence Academy of Art alum. I also met my now husband there, Lucas Griffiths, and since then our educational paths have been the same. From there we moved to study with some wonderful artists at Atelier Dojo in Austin, Texas. But Luke and I were missing the rigor and structure of a full-time program. Quick note, Atelier Dojo now actually does have a full-time program, it just wasn't established when Luke and I were there. So since Luke and I met at a school that worked in the Florence Academy of Art method, in the summer of 2019 we decided to move to New Jersey to study at the Florence Academy of Art US branch. And to make a long story short, that school ended up closing in March of 2020. At the advice of teachers and peers, Luke and I decided to continue our studies at Grand Central Atelier, where we both completed the 4-year full program. So now that I've talked about my background, I want to talk about what ateliers are. In my experience, they are unaccredited art schools, meaning that you don't get a degree or any kind of university accreditation when you graduate. You just get a certificate of completion. And they teach you how to draw and paint through working from a series of studies like plaster casts, Bargue plates, the live figure model. Most ateliers include some kind of anatomy class, but they don't have classes like art business, an in-depth art history course, or art composition. Though in some cases, ateliers will have lectures that are art history centered, or they'll have a still life component, which composition is usually talked about more in depth. Ateliers are most commonly 3 to 4 year programs. You typically draw for the first year, start painting in your second, and that second year usually starts by painting in grisaille. Painting in grisaille is actually something I really loved because I found that coming to grips with the new material, not having a ton of painting experience, it made it really helpful to just strip everything back, no color, just work in black and white, and come to grips with this new material. After a couple months working in grisaille, you progress to either limited palette or full color, depending on the school you're going to. The experience I had at GCA was working from September through December in grisaille, and then in January we came back from winter break and we started working in full color, but the first week back was a color workshop where we learned the Munsell method of color. The Munsell color theory method is what I still use to this day, and from what I can tell, it's becoming more and more commonly used. In my experience at ateliers, as you advance through the program, the focus becomes more on working from the live figure model, portraits, full figure paintings in color. Some schools have where you do a portrait with hands and you do a clothed figure, things like that. And you're doing this all from life throughout the entirety of the 4 years in the program. What I really like about the advanced years in an atelier program is that you generally also get to do more things like still life painting and landscape painting, both of which were offered as components of the program at GCA, and those are primarily offered in the 3rd and 4th year, though there have been instances in the previous years where even students from the earlier years can take part in those classes if there's enough space. Now to get into the specifics of different atelier methods. At GCA you learn comparative measurement, how to block in from Bargue plates, as well as what they call tippy casts, where you take a plaster cast and just physically tip it on its side or at an unusual perspective and practice blocking that in. You draw several different fully rendered casts in graphite, like the one behind me, and you start in the figure room by working on 1-day block-ins before progressing to 3-day block-ins, and then you progress to doing month-long fully rendered graphite figures in the second half of the year, generally starting in January. At GCA, sculpture is also a requirement in the first year, and you start out by sculpting feature casts before you have the option to progress onto more complex casts if you choose to. At Florence Academy of Art, you start by doing fully rendered Bargue plates, like the one behind me, and that all comes from this book, which I will have linked below. You start off by doing, I think, one fully rendered Bargue in graphite, then you move on to fully rendered Bargues in charcoal. This is the final Bargue plate I did at Florence Academy, and it is in charcoal on Roma paper. At Florence Academy, you work primarily in charcoal, and you still start in the figure room with figure block-ins, but you more quickly progress to month-long figure poses as compared to GCA. As I only studied painting at GCA, I can't really compare Florence Academy's painting program with GCA's, but I do want to talk about the pros of each drawing year based on my experience. I would say at GCA, the pros are learning comparative measurement and the emphasis on form understanding and having sculpture as part of the first year core program, and as well as the encouragement to work more structurally in the figure room. Another huge pro in my experience was learning the window shading method because it taught me how to actually finish a drawing. For Florence Academy, the pros would be working in charcoal because it's a much smoother transition into painting as compared to graphite. Another pro for Florence Academy is the emphasis on light effect and really using your full value range to make the most out of creating a visual impact. Something I want to mention right here is that as atelier training is becoming more common and more popular, there are new schools developing that are kind of forging their own unique methods that combine the pros that I just mentioned from the other two schools. And I think that's really exciting because it's amazing that atelier training is becoming more accessible, and it's really exciting that new environments are coming up and new communities are being created, and now we can have more schools that all maybe have like their own thing going on, and I just think that that's a really cool and exciting thing. And nowadays you probably don't have to move across country to get your education. You can just go a state or two over and still get an amazing experience. Back to the topic at hand, what I took away from atelier training was the confidence to draw and paint what I was interested in. I felt like I came away with a working method that demystified the process of creating a finished work of art, meaning that I'm never at a loss when I approach a blank canvas. I know exactly what method I'm going to use, I know how to get the results I want, and I know how to improve them based off of my training. Before finishing the core program at GCA, I didn't feel like I had a working method that yielded consistent results. I didn't feel like I had the confidence to know that once I started a painting, I could finish it. Being an artist is a lifelong self-education, so your whole goal is that every next project, every next painting should be better and better. But now I have a process that I can at least use to attempt to get better and better with each painting and with each passing year. Now to talk about Atelier's cons. The general con to Ateliers is that they are unaccredited, meaning that you don't study anything other than drawing and painting. For me, this was honestly a pro, but I wanted to mention it in case it isn't for everyone. Also, most ateliers do offer some form of scholarship, but it's not exactly a guarantee that you're going to get financial aid, meaning that it can be financially not as viable if you don't have savings or a family that's helping you out. The hours are long and intense, so it's really hard to have a steady job while you're in an atelier. That being said, it's not impossible. I have had classmates and friends that have left the atelier at the end of the day, go work in the evenings, on weekends, and work all throughout the summer to make things work. There are some work-study options, at least at the ateliers that I've been to, but again, these aren't really anything more than supplemental income. It's not enough to live off of by any means. The only other con I can think of is that atelier environments aren't for everybody. They can be intense, meaning they can draw an intense crowd. But even as I say that, I personally did not experience that at FAA US or GCA. I had a really wonderful group of classmates, and I felt fully supported by the community I was in. To wrap up what you'll learn from an atelier, they will give you the skills to draw and paint representationally. They will give you all the tools you need, and studying that intensely for that long means that you'll have a very probably intuitive working method by the time you're done. Now to go over my thoughts after going through all these different schools, I would say that my thoughts are that if you want to gain the skill to draw and paint representationally, if you want to be a figure painter, landscape painter, still life painter, anything that's representational, atelier training is really wonderful. I really enjoyed my atelier training, but that isn't to say that it isn't hard. It is incredibly hard to do full time. It's super intense. It's a lot of long hours. It's a lot of hyperfixating on the smallest little problems and feeling like you're going a little crazy until you finally start to see all the results coming together and you start to see your progress being made. I would say for me personally, the drawing year is the most difficult out of any atelier program I've been to. By the time I got to the painting program at GCA, it was difficult. It was hard to learn to paint because painting is hard, but I mentally was a little bit more prepared, and I found that it was a little bit easier for me to cope with the program at that point as compared to my first year where I was like, what am I doing? So my main thoughts are, if it's possible and you really want to learn to draw and paint representationally, I think ateliers are a great option. I would not go back and do anything differently. Now we're going to move on to the questions I received from you all on Instagram. First question, how often would you receive critiques and how would you decide what to work on next? This is a great question. The specifics of the schedule would change, but I think it basically works out to be between 5 and 6 critiques a week. We would have uninstructed mornings or afternoons here and there. We were not critiqued every day, all day. Some of these critiques were quick and they were just a couple of corrections, and other critiques would be more of an in-depth discussion based off of what they saw you might be struggling with in your project. As for how to decide what to work on next, here I have to say, do as I say, not as I did. What I initially did was, when I first started at Ateliers, particularly at the Florence Academy of Art US branch, I would often just kind of sit around and wait for my critiques so that the teacher could tell me what to work on next. That's not a good way to work. It's not practical. It doesn't help you build a confident working method. So don't do that. But that is what I did, especially at the Florence Academy. That wasn't because of the teachers or the program. It just was because I wasn't confident enough to have a method on my own at that point yet. What I should have been doing the whole time, and what I did start doing finally at GCA, was working on something, let's say a block-in, for example, and I would work on it until I got stuck. And then when I got stuck, I would take a 5-minute break, I'd walk away, I'd come back after the 5 minutes was up and be like, do I see anything else I can fix? Is there anything else I can do at all that I see that I could work on? And if the answer was yes, I would fix it. And I would repeat that process of walking away and coming back until I could not see anything else to fix. And it's like, I think it's done. And if I thought it was done, I would go ahead and just move on to the next step. I would start rendering, that's what you do at GCA, because that's the next step after you block in. And if I had moved on to that next step of rendering and a teacher came by and told me that there was something still wrong in the block-in, I would note that. I would ask them what I could do differently next time. And if the thing is that I just missed it, then I just have to work harder. But if maybe they're like, you didn't inform your block-in enough, you could have done this, and this step. At that point, I was able to ask a question of why I had gone too far, and that was incredibly helpful. But these are things you can't really learn until you do it wrong, or until a situation is presented where you now know what's the right question to ask here. And a lot of that just comes with time and practice. But I would say overall, it's better to move too far and then be told, take a step back, than it is to just constantly wait around for someone telling you what to do. Question 2, how many days a week or hours did you work from the live model? Minimum, you'll work from the live model for 4 to 5 days a week for 3 hours a day. And maximum, you'll do 8 to 11 hours a day for 5 days a week. Earlier on in atelier programs, you'll work a little bit less from the live model, and your time will be divided usually between something like a plaster cast, like what I have right here, and the live figure model. And then when you're more advanced, you're going to work more like that maximum number, and it's going to be lots of figure time all the time. Question 3, what did you learn most from Bargue plates? Bargue plates can get a bad rap for how boring they can be. And admittedly, I used to absolutely hate them. For context, I've done at least 5 fully rendered Bargues, and I do think that's a little bit much. I don't think anyone needs to do 5. Some of those were in graphite and some of those were in charcoal. I've also done a lot of block-ins from the Bargue plates as well. So my biggest takeaway was probably discipline, and that's because when you're learning to copy something so exactly, like almost like a computer, like I am trying to mimic every little thing I see in this Bargue plate, you are pushing yourself to see well beyond what you would otherwise see. And when you're working on a Bargue plate, the thing is, you have a print exactly the size of, like this one behind me. I had an exact size print next to it. So I was just literally transferring over all of my lines, and I could measure to the smallest degree. And the thing that that does is kind of show you how much you would miss, or maybe how much you'd get off if you drew by eye. And so teaching yourself to copy something so exactly is just a great discipline practice. The other takeaway would be technique in either graphite or charcoal, whichever one you're working in, because when you're, again, working on something that's so exact, you're pushing the technical aspect of that medium. So if you're working in graphite, you're not going to be able to get a Bargue plate perfect if it's not super, super sharp. Same thing with charcoal. You have to really be on top of your materials so that you can get the most exact result possible. So I think my biggest takeaways are discipline and technical skill. And block-in, because copying the block-in stage of the Bargue book plates, which you'll see if you flip through the book or if you look at the PDF, there's different stages of the same plate. That's really helpful because it does teach you how to really simplify. Question 4. What different teaching styles did you encounter during the 4 years at GCA? Every teaching style you could imagine. The two dominant ones were teachers who would kind of be quick and give corrections. So they would just give you essentially a list of things to fix. The second type was a teacher who would see what you were working on and kind of pick that moment and then discuss maybe why it's working well or why it's not working and how you could go about fixing it. And so they would be the second type of teacher would teach you a little bit more of like the concepts and the conceptual ideas behind the methodology, as opposed to the first type of teacher, which is just, you need to fix all of these things. Both were very helpful because sometimes it's like learning the concept and the method is great, but if you don't realize all the mistakes you're having, then it's hard to kind of teach yourself to see what's wrong. Whereas if you only had the first type of teaching, then you would end up only ever correcting things and maybe not understanding why it's wrong. Some of the more established teachers could switch between those two teaching styles, and I would say Colleen Berry and Jacob Collins are the two that did that the most. They could kind of see where you were at in your project and kind of which critique you needed more on that day. So some days it would be corrections, and some days they would explain the concept. The last style of teaching I encountered was actually one that was kind of interesting. It was more conversation-based. So how that would generally go is a teacher would come up and ask you, how do you think it's going? And you might say, well, I feel like this is going well, but I feel like this is falling behind. And so then they would be like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Why do you feel like it's falling behind? That was something I encountered more in the 3rd and 4th year as opposed to when I was earlier on in the program. The teacher that I think did that the most was Edward Minoff and actually Lucas Bononi. He was very good about that. They were both really good at like kind of talking with you and then talking through the crit as opposed to talking at you. Question 5. Who was the teacher you got the most from at GCA? My answer is going to be so boring, but I had so many teachers at GCA, it's really impossible to choose. But what I can do is say who I learned the most from in different categories and concepts. So for figure and portrait drawing, I would say Colleen Berry is who I learned the most from. For self-portraits, Gregory Mortensen. For form understanding, Devlin Cecil Wishing. He also later taught a still life class that I took, and he was incredibly influential. Edward Minoff was a fantastic and very encouraging teacher to learn from. He was very good at helping me identify what was going wrong in a project, and he could help me set it on the right course. If I were to give an overall answer, I would say Rodrigo Mateo and Liz Beard. I learned more from Rodrigo than I did from Liz, but they had really similar teaching styles, and they were both really good at giving you very in-depth crits, and they gave me crits that I still pull from and think about to this day. I had some other really amazing teachers that I wish I could have had more time with, like Katie Enberg. She was fantastic. Oh my gosh, just like, again, another really good teacher that could help you identify what was going wrong. Her strength was she could see the overall weakness of your work, so if she felt like you were lacking in one area, then she could identify it and tell you how to fix it. And so that was incredibly helpful, but I only got to study with her for a year. Sandra Sanchez was also a fantastic teacher that I wish I could have had more time with, who was really good at teaching how to make quick, correct decisions and be more decisive. Of course, Jacob Collins is a fantastic overall teacher Jacob Collins really has a skill for looking at your drawing or painting and understanding how you got there, so he can see where you're at, but he can also see the process of how you got there and maybe where you went off path or why it's working. But there's so many more. I got to learn from Samuel Hung, John Bargue, Lucas Bononi, Erica Demetrio. The list goes on. They're all really fantastic. Question 6. So when did you start to think about the kind of work you wanted to make after your atelier training? That's a very good question. For me, I'd say I started thinking about it in my 3rd year at GCA, but I wish I had started thinking about it sooner. Personally, I became so hyper-fixated on what I was doing in the moment, and I became so hyper-fixated on improving my skill. But I wish I would have started thinking about earlier, because then throughout my atelier training, I could have been more so thinking about planning pieces and what I wanted to learn from specific projects that I would use in my later work. I think that would have been a much more useful way to go about it, because you would have been thinking ahead while you were trying to do your best in the current project. Truthfully though, I used to think I would only be a figurative and portrait painter, but being introduced to still life at GCA made me realize that I actually have a lot of ideas and excitement over paintings that would be still life oriented. And so throughout being at GCA, I started thinking about what I wanted to do, because the experience there kind of helped me change what I was maybe thinking I would do. Not that I won't do figurative stuff, but I just now have all these other ideas based around still life, which before attending GCA I used to think was boring. So I would say think about it early on, but allow the experiences that you have at the school to influence what you would make. Not in the sense that you're going to want to just make a bunch of academic pieces on blank backgrounds, but that if you're introduced to landscape or if you're introduced to still life, incorporate those into whatever subject matters you were already planning on pursuing. Question 7. Solid truth on it being available to learn on one's own with information online. Solid truth, yes, if you're willing to pay for online instruction and feedback, and that is because critiques are essential to learning this way of working. Secondly, this can also depend person to person, but self-motivation becomes a lot more important if you're doing this on your own. But I do feel confident in saying that it can be done. It will just be a bit harder and take a bit more time depending on your situation. I know many great painters that have gotten where they're at on their own or with very little atelier experience, so I've seen people do it. I think ateliers feel like they can speed up the process, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible to do without one. Well, that leads wonderfully into my next question, which is, what is the best way to replicate this kind of training at home if it's even possible? My first piece of advice would be to look into online learning opportunities. One-on-one instruction with a teacher that you really like and feel like is communicating the information in a way that makes sense to you is probably the best. The most important thing you need if you're to do this on your own without an atelier is the feedback. You need someone looking at your work, telling you what you can improve upon, and then you keep working at that, and through that you'll see the improvement. If you want to put yourself through as true to atelier training as possible, you'll want to get the Bargue book and a couple plaster casts so that you can be working on those at home and setting them up in a home studio. The second piece of advice I'll give is to do master copies constantly. Copy Da Vinci, copy Michelangelo, copy Russian academic drawings, just copy drawings, because they have done a lot of simplifying and stylization to their drawings that are so good and so effective, and the more we copy them, the more we can see it when we work on our own stuff from life. Definitely try to work from life as often as possible, so whether it be through still life objects around your house or getting family or friends to sit for portrait for you, working from life is really essential. Get a skull, study anatomy. All of this will help you if you want as much of an atelier-esque training as possible at home. Also, and this is pretty important and I think very underrated, pick the materials that you like. So find your pencil brand, find your paper, and stick to it. This is something I was in a little bit of denial about when I went to GCA and was forced to just keep with my materials and keep plugging away at drawings, but I kind of thought that they were doing some magic trick to get the drawings as smooth and beautiful as they were. It is so much time, so much time. And what happens when you change your materials a lot, even just pencil brands, when you change that a lot or you change the paper you're drawing on, you're restarting learning those textures and those materials. So keep it consistent, practice your technique on those, and I think you'll see that you can improve a lot faster. The other thing I want to mention about doing this at home versus doing this in an atelier, the real difference, and I think why people feel like it's not possible to do at home, is because at an atelier, you're doing it every single day. Monday through Friday, a lot of students come in on weekends. It's 8:30 to 8:30, like it's a full 12-hour day sometimes that you can have at these ateliers. And that's why the students improve so rapidly. That's why you see the big difference. There isn't a magic trick to it. It is genuinely just lots and lots of time. So if you're doing this at home, don't beat yourself up if you can't put that time into it, because it's understandable. Not everybody can. But it doesn't mean that you can't learn the same things. It just means that you have to have different expectations as to how fast you can learn them. The improvement happens through sheer time. So to wrap up my answer on is it possible to do at home and what's the best way to replicate it, I would say it's possible. Adjust your expectations for the time that you can put into it and stick to the things that ateliers teach. So particularly when it comes to drawing, focus on block-in, focus on cast drawing, focus on being as exact and academic as possible. There's a lot of resources out there about these things. A lot of them are free even, so definitely look into those. Question 9. What are the typical next steps career-wise after graduating from an atelier? I would say I will first tell you what my impression was based off of whenever I was in my 4th year and what I was thinking my next steps would be, and then a little bit more what I've been personally doing as I try to navigate and figure things out. So after graduating from atelier, you're going to find that most of your pieces are student work, and with that student work, it's beautiful, you've put all this time into it, but it's not exactly sellable. It's not exactly something that you want to approach galleries with. It's often just nude figures on very minimal backgrounds, maybe a refined background, but it has its own very distinct academic look. So after graduating, you really just need to focus on making paintings. And that isn't easy in and of itself. It's very difficult. Most people that I spoke to said that they usually had some form of part-time job, and they would try to make as much money from their part-time job as possible and keep their overhead low, so their daily cost of living, they would keep it as low as possible, and they would try to just make paintings in every other spare moment that they can. That way, they can accumulate enough paintings to start approaching galleries or to start having as a way to market themselves beyond their academic training. The path to having an art career is so difficult and so different for everyone that being very clear with your own goals and motivations and intentions will help cut through and help you make better, more practical choices. For example, if you want to be in galleries, your focus should probably be more so on building up your body of work and your online presence so that you can have that to approach galleries with or have behind you if a gallery notices you on social media. If you want to be in galleries and you're taking on a bunch of commissions, those commissions probably aren't going to help you get closer to your end goal of being in a gallery. Now, all that to say, money is money, especially whenever you've just graduated from an atelier, so if you have the opportunity to get a commission, and especially if that commission aligns with stuff that you're interested in working on, don't hesitate to take it. The main goal that you should have upon graduating is to tailor the steps you take to the career that you want. I hesitate to give any more specific advice than that, simply because I think that different paths work for different people. I can tell you that for myself, my focus is to keep my overhead very low and start making paintings that are beyond the stuff that I was doing in school. So in school, I was doing mostly portrait and figure paintings, and now I want to focus on making still life paintings and, start planning some figurative work in the future that I can take what I've learned from the still life paintings and what I've learned from my time at GCA and combine them all together. And so my current plan is to give myself the time and space to make those paintings. However anyone can make it work. To make it work as an artist is the right way. There's no wrong way to try to do this. The only wrong way is to not do it. I think that is all the questions I have time for today. If I didn't get to yours, I'm so sorry, and be sure to comment them below and I will try to get to them as quickly as possible. Otherwise, if there's any topics in this video that you'd like me to expand upon more and do a whole video dedicated to, again, let me know. Just put it in the comments below and I will do my best to get to that as well. But I just want to wrap up by saying that my experience in an atelier has meant that the pros have outweighed the cons. I got to learn to draw and paint by practicing it all day, every day, surrounded by people that I liked and by teachers that I respected. The last thing that I'll add that's really nice about being in an atelier is that you often learn from your peers as well as your teachers, and that's what makes the environment so exciting and communal. And that's the thing that I've been really fortunate to experience during the little time I had at FAA US, as well as the longer time that I had at Grand Central Atelier. So I hope this video has been informative, and I definitely hope to do more videos like this and more Q&As in the future, so be sure to stick around if you're interested in that. Until next time, bye-bye.